the balance of financial distribution in the country and the power and the political power that exists in America has swayed totally to our side. We're in control of everything now.
When you think of who has power and money in America, it's typically the most privileged, the whitest individuals in our society. And if we don't correct that balance of power and money, we're heading for disaster as a nation.
We cannot survive in a country where half the population is second-class citizens. We need to share the power and money properly, or else we won't have any.
These issues are being created at the systemic level, and they have to be fixed at the systemic level. That means voting, that means accountability, that means aggressive change.
It is time that we in American business understand that the best thing we can do for our businesses is get more money into the pockets of our workers.
Corporate profits have never been greater. Executive compensation has never been higher. We've got the cash. Let's invest in those essential workers. Let's not just clap for them. Let's pay them the cash they've earned.
For other business owners who say they cannot raise the minimum wage, I'm here to testify that you can. I did, and it was great for business.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Power and Money in America, a conversation about the two things that matter most in a capitalist democracy. My name is Morris Pearl. I have the honor of serving as the chairman of the board of the Patriotic Millionaires. I wish we were all together, hanging out, drinking, and eating fancy chocolate. But in the meantime, I hope you're comfortable in our virtual space here. We decided to put this conference together just 63 days into a new administration, a new Congress, because every American, regardless of how they voted, should understand just how unstable our country currently is. How urgently we need to address it now, before it's too late. 7 years ago, I left a 3-decade career on Wall Street to work full-time with the Patriotic Millionaires to fight the inequality and the concentration of wealth and power that is destroying this country. We now live in a political economy that virtually guarantees that we'll become more and more unequal over time. People are marching in the streets, saying they're being treated as second-class citizens, and they're right. And it's only gotten worse during this pandemic. Investors like me are wealthier than we ever were before the pandemic, but almost a fourth of our people have lost their jobs. Millions of Americans don't know where they're going to find money for next month's rent. Their financial challenges reverberate to their landlord, to the guy who owns the corner bar, to the people working in the Apple store, and eventually to people like me who invest in stock. I have a message, a warning really, for my fellow rich people. Reread your history books. Dysfunctional societies don't end well for rich people either. Our friend Nick Hanauer famously warned, the pitchforks are coming for us plutocrats. He's right, but it won't just be pitchforks. There are more guns than people in the United States of America today. I'm old enough to remember the inequality in South Africa in the 1980s. That did not end well for the rich people either. I hope all of you listen to what we have to say. Go to taxtherich.com and join us to help make sure that our nation changes course. Now, I'm turning over the program to my friend, who is the founder and president of the Patriotic Millionaires, Erica Payne.
Thanks, Morris. Hi, everybody. I'm Erica. The Patriotic Millionaires first came together in 2010 during the lame duck session of Congress, when it became clear that President Obama was going to cave to Republican demands to extend the Bush tax cuts. A few dozen millionaires got together and wrote a letter to the president and the Congress that basically said, for the good of the country, raise our taxes. And they just exploded in the media. Since then, we've grown to over 200 members in 33 states. We were featured in 1,600 news stories last year in 75 countries, and we met with countless elected leaders at the state, federal, and local level. Our mission is very simple and very straightforward. We seek to reform the country's political economy so that it naturally produces results that are conducive to a stable, prosperous, and inclusive nation. We orient our work around the three essential elements of the country's political economy. Think of them as the three legs of a three-legged stool. First, what is the distribution of political power? Second, what is the essential relationship between labor and capital? And third, what is the reinvestment strategy through the tax code? Three core values, first principles, if you will: equal political representation, a livable minimum wage, and a fair tax system that requires more of the people who have benefited the most from our capitalist system. We at the Patriotic Millionaires laser focus our work on those three first principles. But today we wanted to pull the camera back and look at power and money in America through a much wider lens. So Morris and I asked ourselves, if we were going to have a fancy dinner party and invite a bunch of interesting people to talk about power and money in America, who would we invite? Today, we brought together 24 of the country's leading activists, intellectuals, and practitioners, and we've asked them to bring their unique perspectives and experiences to this big question about what to do about power and money in America. So sit back and enjoy a lively 2-hour-long presentation, structured as a series of mini TED Talks from some of the smartest people that Morris and I know. We're going to kick it off today with our great friend, Mark Morial, who is president and CEO of the National Urban League. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Erica. In just a few years, America will celebrate its 250th birthday. Imagine that. 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The America that I grew up in was an America fighting the racial oligarch of Southern segregation. And my parents, who were frontline civil rights warriors, instilled in me this lifelong mission to dismantle that racial oligarch of power, where political power and money were concentrated in the hands of a few. And I grew up believing that that concentration of power and money was not only not a good thing, but was also something that was not just, nor fair, nor I would say even moral. So their work and my life's work has been about not only the dismantlement of that, but the lifting up of a different type of vision. And that is a vision of democracy where the right to vote and participate in our civic and political processes was universal and protected and honored and encouraged. And that the idea of economic opportunity was not a slogan or an empty call to action, but something that actually guided public policy. And those ideals and those visions, which were really the ideals and visions of the 1960s and 70s civil rights movement, guide me, animate me, encourage me, and light a fire under me each and every day. So as we face our 250th birthday as a nation, I'm often reminded that people of power have not enough goodwill. And people of goodwill have not enough power. And that for this nation to truly, truly embrace its ideals, but also for it to continue on a path and an arc of greatness, that arc's got to bend towards justice. And central to that justice is economic justice and political justice, which means power that is shared, power that is in the hands of the many, and not just in the hands of a few. I think we can build that kind of America. Are you ready?
Mark is so great. Mark, I am ready. Let's do it. There's only one problem I see: a whole bunch of people with a whole bunch of power standing in our way. President Abraham Lincoln once said, "Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power." Something happens to people when they have power, and it's not pretty. Let's turn to Paul Piff. Paul?
Hi, my name is Paul Piff. I'm a social psychologist and associate professor of psychological science at the University of California, Irvine. About 15 years ago, I set out to understand the psychology of power. And I ran an experiment where we brought in pairs of strangers into the lab and had them play for just 15 minutes a rigged game of Monopoly, where with the flip of a coin, we randomly assigned one of the two players to be the rich player in this game. They got 2 times as much money to start the game with. They got to roll both dice instead of one. They got to move the much more desirable Rolls Royce around the board. And when they passed go, they collected 2 times the salary. Relative to the poor players who got half as much money, they only got to roll 1 die instead of the 2. They moved the measly shoe around the board, and when they passed go, they collected half the salary. And over the course of 15 minutes in this rigged game with hidden cameras, we observed what unfolded. And what we saw gave us a really interesting insight into how people experience and make sense of power in everyday life. What we saw was that the rich player became ruder, even though their privileged position had been determined by the random flip of a coin. They became more entitled, more selfish, more rude in how they behaved toward the other player, less empathetic, less attuned to the plight of that other poor player that they'd been paired with. And at the end of the experiment, when we asked players to talk about why they had experienced the outcomes in the game that they had experienced, we saw that the rich players were far more likely to attribute their inevitable victories in the game to things they themselves had done, decisions they had made, acumen and knowledge of the game that they claimed to have, and far less likely to attribute their victory in the game to features of the situation, including, most importantly, that random flip of the coin that got them in the privileged position in the first place. And I think this tells us a really interesting, important psychological fact about how people make sense of privilege that they experience, power that they experience in everyday life, even when they themselves have done nothing to earn it in the first place.
So Paul talked to us about what happens when people are given power that they haven't earned. Well, let's look now at what happens when people have power and they perceive that power is being pulled away. For that, we're going to turn to Amy Spitalnik to talk about one of the darkest elements of our American experience. Amy is the executive director of Integrity First for America, which is pursuing a landmark civil case against the white supremacists and neo-Nazis who perpetrated the Charlottesville attack and murdered Heather Heyer. Amy?
The rise of violent extremism in this country is really just the symptom of a much larger poison that has undermined this country from the start, which is white supremacy. And we know over the last few years, there's been an alarming rise in far-right extremism. We know that the Department of Homeland Security calls white supremacist terror the most persistent and lethal threat. We know that hate crimes hit record levels, the deadliest levels on record in 2019. We know that according to the ADL, of the extremist murders that have happened in the United States, nearly all of them are attributable to the right, including many to white supremacists. And what's important to understand is that these attacks, the rise of far-right extremism, is fundamentally rooted in this idea of power, this idea that the white man's hold of power on this country is at risk, and that if there isn't violent action by these extremists, the white race will ultimately be replaced. And when you hear them chanting things like Jews will not replace us, or targeting congregations like the one they did in Pittsburgh for its work with refugees and immigrants, it's fundamentally rooted in this idea of replacement theory, the idea that Jews are the puppet masters orchestrating the replacement of the white race through its support for the Black community, the Latinx community, the immigrant and refugee community, and any other community that doesn't fit this vile and narrow definition for what this country can be. Sometimes it manifests in violent, explicit, awful ways like it did in Charlottesville and in Pittsburgh and Poway and El Paso, and of course the Capitol, where this idea of stopping the steal is also fundamentally tied to the same idea of the country being stolen from white people. Other times it manifests in more subtle ways. This idea of George Soros, for example, funding the Black Lives Matter protests, or supporting a caravan coming up from Central America. And both of the ways it manifests are so dangerous because at the end of the day, they fuel this broader tide of white supremacy and extremism that is responsible not just for death and destruction across this country, but also intends to directly undermine our democracy. So what do we do about this? We have tools to fight back. And that's exactly what we're doing at Integrity First for America, seeking to hold accountable those responsible for this violence, for this extremism, and for this hate. We are using our justice system, and we're using a statute that's 150 years old called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 to take on in court the white supremacist neo-Nazis and hate groups responsible for the racially motivated violent conspiracy in Charlottesville 3.5 years ago. We're going to trial this fall, and we've already had direct financial, legal, and operational impacts on the defendants in our suit, with Richard Spencer, the country's leading neo-Nazi, calling it, quote, financially crippling. We know that accountability works and that it matters. And the reason we've seen this horrific rise in extremism over the last few years is because it's been able to go on largely unchecked with so little accountability and so little justice. So at a moment where there's change in Washington, when there's the urgency of this crisis front and center in the aftermath of the Capitol attack, it's so important to make clear that you take on these extremist abuse of power by holding them accountable using the power that we have, which is our justice system, which is our democracy. That's what we're doing. We go to trial in October, and we hope that our case can also not just bankrupt and dismantle the groups and the leaders at the center of this violent movement, but also serve as a model for accountability and justice at a moment when it's so sorely needed.
These white supremacists are so scared of losing their status and their power, and that fear has turned into violence and hate. But according to our next guest, progress that seems to terrify them so much in some ways is an illusion. Our system is still stuck in neutral, and real gains for Black and Brown Americans and women still remain out of reach. For more on that, we're going to turn to CBS political analyst Jamal Simmons.
Thank you, Erica. You know, I spent years focused on the tech diversity problem, trying to figure out why our most innovative sector was leaving out so many of our most innovative people. And then I learned over the past year that tech isn't alone. In macroeconomics, the term called the NAIRU, it stands for the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is basically the maximum rate of unemployment the economy can reach without triggering inflation. In diversity, there's a NAIROB, non-altering institutional rate of Blackness. This is the maximum percentage of Black leadership an institution can attain without actually altering its behavior or its culture. That fixed rate is about 4%. The number pops up everywhere. Only 4.5% of Harvard professors are Black, and even fewer are tenured. The number's about the same at Michigan and at Duke. It's even worse, lower, at Yale and at Stanford. 4% of publishing executives are Black. 4% of employees at venture capital firms are Black. 4% of corporate board members. 3.2% of Fortune 500 C-suite executives. At Amazon, only one of its 25 most senior S-team executives is African American. That's 4%. That number is 3% or lower at Apple, Facebook, and Google. The trend continues in the arts and in law. At the Supreme Court between 2005 and 2018, there were 487 Supreme Court clerks hired. 20 of them were African American. It's 4.1%. And this isn't a liberal versus conservative kind of thing. Even the liberal icon, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, only hired one black law clerk in 25 years on the court. Even institutions that may genuinely want to change just aren't getting there. We've gone as far as we can without a more systemic intervention. We will not get to scale betting on mainstream institutions to find and produce black talent alone. It's not an accident that Mellody Hobson spread her wings at Ariel Investment before she became board chair at Starbucks, or that Darren Walker was successful at the Abyssinian Development Corporation in Harlem before going to Rockefeller and the presidency of the Ford Foundation. The most stark examples in education. My alma mater, Morehouse College, 2,200 students. They graduate about 400 black men every year. In 2016, Texas A&M, among the largest populations of undergrads in the country, 49,000, they only graduated 83 black men. And at University of Michigan, they're a little bit better, 30,000 undergrads, but only 300 people of color, black people, who graduated. Mainstream institutions should foster formal networks with black-led organizations, invest in them to source more black talent, with the understanding that some of that talent will laterally transition into key roles at those mainstream institutions. After the George Floyd killing, Google pledged to invest $5 million in black founders and diversify its leadership by 30%. Those goals should be complementary because black founders will likely find talent Google never would, and frankly, probably wouldn't hire. Whether or not the startup succeeds, some of those team members get laterally transitioned into Google with real-life experience. Then the company should compensate those other companies for sourcing black talent, like a finder's fee, and compensate those new leaders for mentoring and advising junior black staff to increase the success of their own internal pipeline. We've tried to do this in an informal way, and things just haven't changed. Formalizing this pipeline would be a systemic response to the systemic 4% fixed NAROB problem. America's competing with the world, and we need more innovative leaders at the table. We don't have any more time to wait.
In order to make sure that all of our structures of power reflect our greatest strength, which is our diversity, we've got to begin with the kind of work that Jamal is talking about, but we've also got to start from the real building blocks of distributed power, and that's the vote. So for more on that, let's turn to Andrea Haley. Andrea.
Hi, my name is Andrea Haley, and I'm the CEO of Vote.org. 77 years ago, my grandfather jumped off of a ship into 10 feet of cold water and hit the beaches of Normandy in World War II. When he completed his service, he came home to a country that used a grab bag of tactics, from poll taxes to police intimidation, to prevent him from voting because he was black. The message was clear. He could fight alongside his fellow soldiers in war, but he could not participate alongside his fellow citizens in determining the direction of his country by using his voice and casting his ballot. Over 50 years and 2 generations of my family members later, I'm still standing here fighting for that most basic right, the ability to choose who represents us in government. There are 2 kinds of people in America today. Those that believe in the promise of our democracy and the inherent right of people to elect their representatives, and those that believe in some other type of government, an authoritarian rule not subject to public accountability. The mission of Vote.org is to make sure that the first group wins. We are working to reach the very people our election system intentionally leaves behind. Black communities targeted by voter suppression, young people who face confusing and outdated registration processes, workers who too often have to choose between their paycheck and their ability to vote. Vote.org streamlines the registration process, making it easier for everyone to register online. We target our advertising and get out the vote efforts to communities of color, from Black neighborhoods in Georgia to Navajo Nation neighborhoods in Arizona. We advocate for companies to give paid time off to their workers to vote. In 2020, our work and that of our allies changed the electorate. Vote.org helped 34 million voters register or request a mail-in ballot last year. Of those 34 million voters, 44% were under the age of 30 and more than half were women. More than 1,000 companies signed our pledge and gave 1 million workers paid time off to vote. We made over 600 million voter contacts through text message, food trucks, billboards, radio ads, and more. As a result, we just witnessed the highest turnout in more than 120 years in our nation. A historic number of Americans were able to exercise their right to vote. But a small group of people who want to see a different kind of government in our country, they are not going to give up their power easily. Newton's law says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And we're seeing that now in state houses across our country. So far this year, we've already seen over 252 bills introduced around the country, specifically aimed at making it harder for people to vote. The provisions include things like restricting mail-in voting, removing early vote days, shortening voting hours on election day itself, and ending automatic voter registration. These are the same kinds of tactics, the same kinds of people that challenged my grandfather when he returned home from World War II service when he tried to vote. It's shameful that in the face of more Americans voting than ever before, the pro-authoritarian forces that are present in our democracy today want to make it harder for people to participate. But we're not going to let them win. Within our legacy lies our future. And if my grandfather and his contemporaries could fight authoritarian forces abroad, come home and fight and secure their voting rights here in our country, surely we have the tools and tactics necessary to fight this historic rollback of voter rights that's happening right underneath us right this very moment. But we need your help. So please go to vote.org and see how you can help today. This is a unique moment in time, and each and every one of us must rise to meet the challenge, just as the generations before did. Thank you.
Thank you. 2020 was such a remarkable election, and a lot of good things happened in 2020. But my friend Angelo is here to talk to us about some of the scary things that happened in 2020. Angelo, how would you describe the dark side of the 2020 election?
Marjorie Taylor Greene. And the reason why she's so scary is not just because of all the things that she believes and says. It's because she's not the only one in Congress or state houses across the country. Hi, I'm Angelo Carasone. I'm the president and CEO of Media Matters for America. And today, I'm going to talk to you about how Marjorie Taylor Greene and a bunch of others just like her got into the halls of Congress and what that means going forward. As early as 2018, right, the first few weeks of that year, we started seeing a trend where QAnon, just at that point was just a few Twitter accounts and other accounts talking about this conspiracy theory, linked up with a group called Operation Rescue. Operation Rescue is an extreme anti-choice organization that believes in violence as a tactic. They use that to achieve their political objectives. They have a body count. So it wasn't just unsettling that this group that's proven to have real-world harms started to link up with this new conspiracy theory. It was also because we knew that Operation Rescue was actually part of and reflective of a much broader infrastructure problem that exists in the media landscape, in the information landscape. Operation Rescue had scale. But when they were to engage, we knew that meant that there would be power and that QAnon could not just have a superhighway to grow and spread, but that it could actually build some real political power behind it. And that's exactly what happened. During the 2020 election, there were 90 primaries that had a QAnon adherent running. 24 candidates, QAnon candidates, actually made their way onto the ballot in November, and several of them won their elections and are walking the halls of Congress right alongside Marjorie Taylor Greene. So what does it mean? Well, it's not going away. It means that the right is going to continue to organize power on the fringes, but it also means something else. Because the same thing that led to the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and others like her also creates another massive distortion and actually makes it harder for us to respond to the avalanche of misinformation and lies that come from these extremists. They distort the news. And no matter what the issue is, policy fight, political campaign, culture debate, the way the media deals with it is going to greatly influence and shape the outcome. And what we see every day as a result of a massive imbalance that exists between the right and the left is that policies that have 70 and 80% public support are described as far left, everywhere from the New York Times to the Washington Post to NBC News to MSNBC to CNN. And that is a reflective of this deeper crisis that exists in our landscape. This picture is actually an example, illustration of that crisis. That red line at the top is the share of voice between the right and the left online. And if you can see, there was not a single moment during the entire 2020 year that the left or news actually dominated or had any influence over the conversation. That's the very crisis that leads to more extremism, like Marjorie Taylor Greene and the power behind it. And that's the crisis that leads to the distortion in our conversations. The second part is actually the imbalance between the right and the left. It took $2 billion extra just to break even. Democrats had to spend $2 billion more just to break even. That is not sustainable if we have to continue to have that kind of imbalance. So what do we do about this crisis? There are two things. One, we need to stop the right's cheating. A lot of what they do is cheat, and there are ways to stop it. And the second is we need to invest in our own storytellers.
Whew! Thanks, Angelo. You can always count on Angelo to come in with some really mind-blowing, disturbing facts. 90 QAnon candidates, and they found an infrastructure in the anti-choice movement with Operation Rescue. So let's turn our attention to the anti-choice movement. What's that all about? I've invited my friend Elise Hogue here to talk to us about it. Elise?
Hi, my name is Elise Hogue. I'm an ecologist by training. Erica loves to tell people I studied bats. I've spent my entire adult life analyzing social and political systems, looking for interventions that can catalyze maximum change. I cut my teeth as a political activist in the fight against the World Trade Organization. And more than a decade later, I somewhat abruptly flipped from that economic justice work into what we now call identity politics when I became the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, a role I have today. Being on the front lines of the so-called culture wars has advised my ideas on how to beat the right wing. I'll start by saying, if you can't handle a little hypocrisy, you probably shouldn't work in politics. But self-professed right-wing pro-lifers have turned hypocrisy into an art form. Whether it's Jerry Falwell's dalliance with the pool boy or the former RNC deputy finance chairman paying $1.6 million to a Playboy playmate he had an affair with after she had an abortion, or Scott DesJarlais, a Tennessee congressman known for boasting about his 100% anti-choice voting record after he was outed publicly for allegedly encouraging a 24-year-old patient with whom he was having an affair to have an abortion. The list goes on. And to be clear, this profound hypocrisy is endemic because it isn't and never has been about abortion. It was always about power. Power for a minority achieved through allegiance to social status. Let's look back to the early days of the Federalist Society, today one of the most powerful and anti-democratic forces of the right. In April of 1982, on the campus of Yale University Law School, a group of ambitious, deeply conservative students convened to counter the social upheaval of the 70s. Those gathering wanted to mitigate the threat to their power and position by using the courts to lessen the power of those seeking to displace them. At that time, like now, everyone from workers to women to Black people were demanding seats at the table, seats that were then occupied by white men, like those at this meeting. The group needed a marker of a willingness to carry forward their agenda of economic, social, and political hegemony as a test for membership. They chose a hostility towards Roe v. Wade. Why? It was perfect. Opposition to abortion could easily be cloaked in an unimpeachable yet false claim of religiosity, and more importantly, it mapped perfectly with hostility to other forms of social progress, racial, gender, and yes, economic equity. These forms of progress that were deeply threatening to the men in this group and to the women who enjoyed the privilege of proximity. Hostility to abortion became the tip of the spear for a broad-ranging agenda grounded in the desire to maintain control in a rapidly changing world. Now, to hear them tell it, we're the ones playing identity politics. But the truth is that their strategy, that hinges on identity politics. When our side argues about whether identity or economics is more important, we lose and they win. Understand that right-wing elites seek first and foremost to keep all of the money and all of the power in their own hands. As such, they have very little to offer their followers. Since they won't share the spoils of war with their foot soldiers, in order to enlist them, they must offer them something else. That something is status. Why are the victims of right-wing economics also its most ardent supporters? Because right-wing politics offers a brass ring, the promise of social status. Not status based on your achievements, but status based on history and DNA, status that historically was afforded for being white, for being male, for being cis, and for being straight. For people who are watching a loss of money, power, and opportunity, the direct result of right-wing economics, status is one of the only things they have left. As it turns out, enough voters will cling to that psychological life raft to deliver right-wing elites the power they need to enact their agenda. Convincing voters that someone else's expanded rights come at a cost to you is a powerful political tool, one that ultimately advances the right-wing goal of hegemonic control. So next time you hear identity politics is hindering our goals for economic equality, flip the script and expose them for playing status politics to keep the majority of Americans from asserting our rights to access economic, social, and political equality.
Elise has helped us understand how the anti-choice movement is really just an infrastructure designed to prevent people from having sufficient economic power and other kinds of power. What if I told you that an entire industry, one of the largest in the United States, is also structured in such a way to ensure the suppression of the people who work within it? Let's turn to Sarah Jayaraman.
Hi, my name is Sarah Jayaraman. I'm the president of One Fair Wage and a professor at UC Berkeley. The restaurant industry has been one of the largest and fastest growing segments of the US economy with almost 14 million workers, but it's also been the absolute lowest paying, largely because of the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. It represents the chains, the IHOPs, the Applebee's, the Olive Gardens, and it's been around since emancipation of slavery, when it first demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves, not pay them anything at all, and have them live entirely on this new idea that had just come from Europe called tips. So slavery in the United States changed tipping as a concept from being an extra or bonus on top of the wage to becoming a replacement for wages because of the desire to hire Black labor and not pay for the value of it. And that became law in 1938 as part of the New Deal, when everybody got the right to the minimum wage for the first time, except for tipped workers who are mostly Black and told you get a $0 wage. We went from $0 in 1938 to the whopping and incredible $2.13 an hour today. Today, 70% of tipped workers are women, disproportionately women of color, struggling on this absurd wage of $2, trying to make ends meet, and struggling with the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry because they have to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families and tips. This only got worse during the pandemic, when millions of these workers couldn't get unemployment insurance because they were told that their wages were too low to qualify, and now are forced to go back to work. Tips are down 50 to 75%, and thousands of workers are reporting that they are being asked by male customers to take off their masks so men can judge their looks and therefore their tips on that basis. It is a grotesque and life-threatening situation that is perpetuated by a grotesquely powerful trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association that has wielded power over both parties, and it is time for them to stop. It is time for these lobbyists to be held accountable, this trade lobby to be held accountable by others who can say it is time for both Democrats and Republicans to actually listen to the people who voted for the first time in record numbers, low-wage service workers who voted for the first time in record numbers because they thought this administration and this Congress would deliver for them, would deliver a $15 minimum wage. We ourselves mobilized over 100,000 low-wage service workers in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Georgia who voted thinking that their wage was going to go up from $2 to $15 because this administration and this Congress was going to deliver. If they don't, if this administration and Congress doesn't deliver, We can assure you that we will not win in 22. We will not win in 24. We have to stand up to the likes of the National Restaurant Association and stand up for the women of color in this industry who voted for the first time because they thought we were going to get one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top.
Thank you, Saru. Anybody who spends 5 minutes with me knows the minimum wage issue makes me crazy. This country was founded on the exploitation of human labor, and that exploitation is continuing today. The minimum wage has lost 40% of its purchasing power since its peak in 1968. Democrats insisted they were going to pass a $15 federal minimum wage, but they've still got 8 of their caucus who refuse to support it. Republicans, in contrast, introduced a bill for $10 an hour 5 years from now. The lead sponsor of that bill, Tom Cotton, is from a state, Arkansas, that already has an $11 minimum wage. So has Tom Cotton actually introduced a bill to make sure the people in his state make less money? If anybody ever needed to understand how broken our political system is, it is this issue. Raising the minimum wage is wildly popular across people of all parties and no party. So if our 2 party leaders can't get it done, it just might be time for a third party. Maurice?
Hi, I'm Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. Many of you have heard of us, but for those of you who haven't, just wait. A Gallup poll last month showed that support for a third political party is at an all-time high. 62% of U.S. adults say the 2 big political parties do such a poor job representing the American people that a third party is needed. That's where the Working Families Party comes in. For more than 20 years, we've been giving people a choice outside the 2-party system. We are building our party on top of the 2-party system, and it's working. We recruit and train people-powered candidates to run up and down the ballot. Sometimes we run candidates through the Democratic Party primaries. Other times we run candidates on the WFP ballot line. Some people think of third parties as being spoilers, or that voting third party is a wasted vote. This is not that. We play to win, and we win big. During the 2020 election cycle, the WFP helped now Congressman Jamal Bowman defeat an incumbent who'd been in office for 3 decades. We ousted a district attorney in the nation's largest county, and we've elected hundreds of progressive champions from the courthouse to Congress across the nation. In 2019, Kendra Brooks made history, becoming the first candidate not from one of the 2 major parties to win a seat on Philadelphia City Council under the WFP ballot line. But it's not all smooth sailing. Disrupting the status quo has earned us powerful enemies with big megaphones. One far-right news network went nuts when they uncovered our secret agenda of universal health care, child care, millions of green jobs, a $15 minimum wage, a reform of police departments, moving investments into schools and communities, and other things. Our party eviscerated the IDC, a breakaway group of Democratic state senators in New York who caucused with Trump Republicans. We primaried them and opened the floodgates for the most progressive legislative session in New York. That really upset Andrew Cuomo, the embattled governor of New York, who then plotted to destroy us by planting a poison pill provision in election law in an attempt to kill third-party politics. It backfired. We're stronger than ever in New York and growing in several other states, building the political party of our dreams. We're using money and power to build that political party of our dreams and construct the nation and world we deserve. And if you see yourself aligning with that vision for society, I'd invite you to join us by texting WFP to 30403. That's WFP to 30403.
Maurice, thank you so much. I love learning about the Working Families Party because, after all, what is this about besides working families in America? But I worry that kind of whoever is in charge, this whole system is so awash with money. How are we going to fix it when our lawmakers just cannot seem to be held accountable? For thoughts on that, let's turn to Kedrick Payne.
Hi, I'm Kedrick Payne, General Counsel and Senior Director of Ethics at Campaign Legal Center. Today, I want to talk about money in power. And to understand money and power in America, you have to understand money and influence in Congress. And more importantly, to understand money and influence in Congress, it's necessary to understand the lack of accountability of members of Congress when it comes to the many ethics laws that are intended to stop the influence of wealthy special interests on legislation. I think the best example of that is the rule that prohibits the solicitation of campaign contributions in a way that links the donor and that donation to an official act. And it also is a prohibition to have the appearance that a donation gives you special access to a member of Congress. Now, this is a core rule that is violated routinely, and it has been turned on its head. So not only are members violating the rule, but they're using the actual strategy of enhancing the appearance of a link between campaign contributions and their official acts to raise more money. Several years ago, when there was major legislation pending to reform Wall Street in the wake of the financial crisis that led to the Great Recession, several members of the Financial Services Committee staged very precise and well-timed fundraisers to make sure that they were able to have Wall Street banks give them the most contributions possible right before votes. They had these solicitations occur right at the same time that amendments were being proposed on the legislation that would weaken the rules that would regulate the banks. And then they had these campaign contributions, or these fundraisers, I should say, on the day before and the day of the actual vote. This was very controversial when it came to the attention of the Ethics Committee because the allegations forced them to answer the question of whether or not this clear example of a violation of the rule would be enforced. And the big part that was seen across DC was that if this type of activity was seen as a problem, it would disrupt all fundraising because that's what it was all based on. Well, needless to say, the Ethics Committee found that there was no violation and no appearance of misconduct and no appearance of a link just because a lawmaker went to a bank the day of vote on legislation that would impact that bank. Fast forward several years to 2021, and you see how this problem has just become even worse. Right after the attack on the Capitol in January, multiple corporations suspended their contributions to members of Congress because they were just upset with the way that the debate on the results of the election fueled the attack. Well, in response to that threat to not give campaign contributions, staffers, both Democratic and Republican, said that they would not provide access to their members of Congress without those campaign contributions and would not work on legislations to support those companies without campaign contributions. This has become a situation where without ethics enforcement, you have no accountability and a situation where public's trust is diminished because they see the connection between money and influence. The answer comes down to enforcement. But the question is, how do you create more enforcement in the Senate and in the House? An independent investigative body for the Senate would be a step in the right direction. A recent Campaign Legal Center report showed that over the course of 10 years, the Senate Ethics Committee received hundreds of complaints. They dismissed half of those complaints and only found violations in 3% of those complaints. When you have a committee on ethics that is comprised of members who are supposed to police themselves, you run into a situation where there's no policing at all. The same thing has happened in the House Ethics Committee. However, they do have an independent investigative body called the Office of Congressional Ethics. That body starts investigations, and they've been successful with conducting investigations and finding that violations have occurred. However, when their referral or their recommendation to the committee for discipline is received, the House Committee on Ethics typically fails to take action. That needs to be fixed by putting more pressure on the chairpersons of both the House Ethics Committee and the Senate Ethics Committees to hold members accountable. So in conclusion, it should be seen that money and power in America can be directly tied to the lack of enforcement of ethics rules when it comes to the role of money and influence in Congress. And hopefully now is the time where action will be taken to resolve that problem. Thank you.
Kedrick, what a great presentation. Thank you. It's very disturbing to learn that we've actually set up our Congress in such a way to facilitate corruption, to facilitate undue influence. And who are some of those people trying to have undue influence on our political system? Well, look no further than America's CEOs. Interesting fact, CEOs are 4 times more likely than the general population to be sociopaths. Let's learn more about CEOs from Sarah Anderson. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Anderson. I work at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., but I grew up on a farm in a conservative part of the Midwest. And whenever I go home and people ask me, hey, what the heck is it that you do out there in Washington? I always talk about my research on CEO pay. That's because I've learned that CEO pay gets everybody's blood boiling. And folks are especially outraged when CEOs pay themselves hundreds, if not thousands of times more than they pay their workers. Sadly, these obscene disparities are continuing throughout the pandemic. And at many corporations, boards are bending the rules to protect CEOs while so many others are suffering. Take Coca-Cola, for example. None of the top executives made their bonus targets last year, but the board gave them all bonuses anyway, saying they wanted to reward them for their resilience in the face of the pandemic. The CEO wound up with more than $18 million, more than 1,600 times as much as the company's typical worker pay. Or take a look at Tyson's. The top executives there didn't meet their bonus targets either. So what did the board do? They gave them a bunch of stock to make up the difference. One of these execs is billionaire John Tyson, who made more than $11 million as company chairman. If the board had spent as much time protecting their workers as they did protecting their executives, maybe we wouldn't have seen so much COVID in Tyson plants. At least 38 of the company's workers have lost their lives to the virus. Quite a number of CEOs scored PR points last year by announcing they were going to give up some of their base salary. A noble gesture? Not really. Straight salary makes up only a tiny portion of their overall pay. The CEO at A.O. Smith made a big deal about taking a 25% salary cut. Meanwhile, his overall compensation soared 36%. I know these stories would make people's blood boil back home. But I also know that a lot of people who share my outrage at excessive CEO pay think there's nothing we can do about it. That's where they're wrong. I'll just talk about one policy solution that's gaining momentum. A bill in Congress, the Tax Excessive CEO Pay Act, would increase taxes on corporations with huge gaps between their CEO and worker pay. The wider their pay gaps, the larger their tax bill. This would give corporations an incentive to rein in executive pay and lift up worker wages, all while generating an estimated $150 billion in revenue over 10 years. Momentum for this federal bill is bubbling up around the country. 2 cities, Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco, have already adopted such taxes, and lawmakers in at least 9 states have introduced similar proposals. People are fed up with excessive CEO pay. Now it's time to actually do something about it.
Sarah, thank you so much for all your great work. I think patriotic millionaire Abigail Disney said it best a few years ago when she said, even Jesus Christ himself does not deserve that much money. But it's not just the ratios of CEO pay to worker pay. There's also another way that CEOs line their pockets. There's a great old quote from J.R. Ewing. He said, Daddy used to tell me, if you can't get in the front door, go around the back. So let's learn about how CEOs are going in the back door to get themselves even more money. Bill?
As we speak, U.S. corporations are being looted, and it is by and large legal, although it shouldn't be. The loot takes the form of open market share repurchases, also known as stock buybacks, Over the decade 2010-19, constituent companies in the S&P 500 index did $5.3 trillion in buybacks, equal to 54% of their combined net income, on top of $3.8 trillion in dividends, another 39% of net income. The payout ratios are crucially important because when a company is profitable, the earnings it retains provides the financial foundation for reinvestment in its productive capabilities. This reinvestment is critical not only for purchasing new and improved plant and equipment, but also for enhancing the productivity of the company's labor force through training and experience. With this higher productivity, the company can afford over time to provide stable employment opportunities and increase employee pay while generating the higher quality, lower cost products that will keep the company competitive in the future. Companies that retain and reinvest share their prosperity with their value-creating employees and emerge as even more profitable over time. Stock buybacks have been undermining retain and reinvest at Americans' largest and most profitable companies, resulting to the contrary in downsize and distribute. These companies look for ways to downsize employment and pay in order to increase the profits that they can distribute to shareholders in the form of buybacks and dividends. These distributions lift stock yields for a time, but at the cost of contributing to unstable employment, inequitable incomes, and declining global competitiveness. And increasingly, that has become the unfortunate story of U.S. economic performance.
Bill, thank you so much for your incredible work. So basically, what we've learned in the last little bit is that CEOs pay themselves entirely too much in the first place. And then when that compensation isn't enough for them, they manipulate the stock price of the companies they're running in order to enrich themselves even further. And to add insult to injury, they're actually hurting the companies that they're running and hurting America's competitiveness in the process. So what in the world are we going to do about this? For that, I turn to my friend, Ryan Grimm from The Intercept. Ryan?
In order for our country to find a way forward, we have to first look back to figure out where we went wrong. I want to start in the 1980s, when America's political parties, both of them, took a turn toward big money fundraising. So they say sometimes supply creates its own demand, and that's a big part of what happened in Washington in the 1980s. And that's the root cause of the capture of our government today. In the 1980s, the phrase greed is good began making the rounds. Not because greed was a new phenomenon, but because for the first time since the Gilded Age, greed was rewarded. After World War II, the top marginal income tax rate was 94%. During the Eisenhower years in the 1950s, it was 91%. It only applied to a few families, and almost nobody actually paid that high rate. But those rates were still really important. Why? Not because the high rates brought in a lot of revenue, but because it discouraged earning stratospheric amounts of income in the first place. Why bother to be greedy when you have to pay a 90% marginal tax rate? It's pointless. So why bother to have high tax rates that almost no one pays? Because the reality is that making that much money is almost always the result of destructive, antisocial behavior. In other words, there's no value, no real value a person can add to the world that is worth $1 million a week every single week. Taking from other people in ways that are deeply damaging to society, that leaves wreckage behind, is practically speaking one of the only ways to make that kind of income. The 1980s saw the birth of corporate raiders, now renamed private equity investors, who used leveraged debt to take a controlling stake in a company, liquidate its assets, liquidate its pension fund, then file for bankruptcy protection and lay off the workers. The real purpose of a high marginal tax rate is not to seize money from the rich. Frankly, we don't actually need their money to do the things we need done. Rather, it's to discourage the rapid accumulation of wealth by one person or one firm. High rates are intended to stop private equity investors from even thinking about, say, taking over Sears and siphoning the value from it before killing it. Sure, they could do it, but with a 90% marginal rate on extreme incomes, what's the point? The 1980s, an era of big hair and cocaine, marked a pivot point in the country. The new policy of the 1980s was to encourage extreme incomes and rapid wealth accumulation. Top rates were cut by Reagan and the Democrats from 70 down to 50 and down under 30% by the end of the decade. Just as campaigns were becoming exponentially more expensive thanks to the dominance of television, a new class of super rich, who frankly could see how the government could enrich them, were available to tap for the needed funds. Those super rich were simultaneously using their new power to demolish organized labor, looting their pensions in the process, which exacerbated the Democratic funding gap. Political scientist Daniel Schlossman of Johns Hopkins has done some of the best research on precisely how the Democrats went from a party of workers and people to one dominated by Wall Street then. His conclusion is at once surprising and intuitive. As Democrats were hunting for corporate cash, most of the industries they flirted with created backlash elsewhere in the coalition, often from labor or environmentalists. Wall Street in the early 1980s wasn't the untamed violent beast it is today, so initially, the finance industry was a relatively inoffensive source of party cash. Like any addiction, it seemed harmless at first. And like all addictions, it turned out to be worse than we could have imagined. Low tax rates today don't just lead to yawning inequality, but they also produce the supply of cash that is destroying our politics and our country.
Thank you so much, Ryan. That was great. So in all my years of working in politics, I've basically seen that wealthy people are trying to manipulate the political system for two things. The first one is tax cuts that Ryan talked about. And the second is they want to see a reduction in regulations. Why do they want to see that? Well, they want to see that so that they can consolidate their corporate power as well. We started off today hearing about a rigged monopoly game. And so now we're going to turn to one of the country's leading experts on monopolies, the corporate kind, not the board game. Barry?
I never imagined that I'd dedicate my life to fighting monopolists. My dad grew up sharecropping strawberries in Florida. When I was growing up, my dad mowed lawns. I worked in factories, construction, driving trucks. I thought the only way to make life better was through unions. But in Florida, there really weren't any. I got lucky. I got to go to a good university. I got to travel the world. Eventually, I got to work as a journalist. For a while, I still focused mainly on how to use unions to concentrate the power of working people. In fact, I got fired from my first newspaper job for trying to organize. But in my work as a journalist, I also came to understand there was this other realm of power, which is the power that is concentrated over us when we let a few people monopolize control over our markets, over our communities, over our lives. One of the great achievements of the American Revolution was to break the power of the private monopoly governments of that day, like the British East India Company. Then, for 200 years in America, citizens used various forms of anti-monopoly law to protect our liberties and our democracy from concentrated private power. What I learned working as a journalist was that in the early days of Ronald Reagan, 4 decades ago, folks in the White House changed the basic rules we use to run our economy. The Reagan people tore up the people's rules, the rules we established back during the Revolution, and they imposed new rules, rules written in the University of Chicago School of Economics, rules designed to make it really easy to make a monopoly and to exercise power over other people. Life's been hard for a long time in America. Hard for our farmers, hard for our independent business people, and really hard for working people. Yet part of the reason is because Reagan, part of the reason is because Reagan busted a lot of unions. But the other reason is because Reagan, and after him, Bill Clinton, made it so easy to make monopolies. Today, just about every problem we face in America is caused by, or made worse by, the monopolists Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton unleashed. It is the monopolist who drives down the people's wages while driving up the prices the people must pay, who drives the farmer from the land and the shopkeeper from the store, who drives up the cost of health care and of good drugs while flooding our families with opioids and sugars and tobacco, who endangers our public health and pollutes our air and water, who threatens the freedom of our press, and who misinforms, incites, and needlessly enrages our citizens for profit. It is the monopolist who taxes, manipulates, extorts, and steals other people's businesses, and who chokes off innovation, growth, opportunity, and a good future. I'm still a union man, but today I am also an anti-monopoly man, or rather a democracy man, because we should never forget that monopoly directly threatens democracy. After all, it was monopolists who delivered us Donald Trump and Trumpism. There is good news. Americans are finally awakening to this crisis of concentrated power. Better yet, enforcers and legislators are rising to the challenge. Just last fall, the Justice Department, FTC, and states across America brought 5 lawsuits against Google and Facebook. And working people are now leading the fight against Amazon, one of the most dangerous of monopolies, through the Athena Coalition. But this fight is really just beginning. All of us, everywhere in America, we have to learn what we can do to fight the monopolists and to rebuild democracy. I look forward to having you join us. Check out our work at Open Markets. This is the battle of this century, and we intend to win it.
Barry, you're right. This is the battle of the century, and we have to win it. So for more thoughts on how to win it, let's turn to Sarah Miller, another warrior in the battle against monopoly power. The New York Times profiled Sarah in an article called "She Wants to Break Up Big Everything." So let me just start with a question. Sarah, do you want to break up big everything? And if so, why?
Thanks so much, Erica. That's a great question. The New York Times was right. I do want to break up big everything. The reason why is simple. Big everything is a big problem. Monopoly power, so corporate concentration, impacts a whole range of economic and social problems, everything from income inequality to depressed wages to lower rates of entrepreneurship and business dynamism to healthcare costs, farm bankruptcies, the decline of the free press, and entrenched systems of racial inequity. So I know that Patriotic Millionaires and your allies have been fighting so hard to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Part of that reason why this fight is so hard is because employer labor markets are so concentrated and so powerful that workers simply don't have the freedom to change jobs and to advocate for higher wages and better working conditions. One study found that workers would be making $10,000 more every year if employer labor markets were less concentrated. So what do ultimate fighting champions have in common with new moms, for example? They're both getting screwed by corporate monopolies. Over the last 40 years, economic concentration across a broad range of markets has gotten more severe. Healthcare, tech, agriculture, the list goes on and on. Even in niche industries like eyeglasses, baby formula, meat processing, mattresses have less and less competition. These companies are usually deeply integrated with Wall Street interests, and they yield tremendous power over our economy and democracy. So why should this matter to you? It raises prices for consumers. It lowers wages for working people. It inhibits the creation of good jobs. This concentration of power also stymies innovation. It squishes small businesses that simply can't compete. And at the end of the day, it affects and destabilizes our democracy. So I don't know about you, but I would rather live in a democracy than whatever Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg had in mind. I think Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said it best, quote, "You'll know well. We can have democracy in this country, or we can have concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." And that's the choice we're faced with today. So in order to protect our democracy, we have to rewire our economy, beginning with the biggest corporations in industries from tech to agriculture. 35 years ago, Robert Bork observed, "Antitrust policy cannot be made rational until we're able to give a firm answer to one question. What is the point of the law? What are its goals?" Bork proposed what he called a consumer welfare standard, and that standard has led to a whole host of problems for our country, which I've just talked about. Congress should clarify that the purpose and goal of antitrust is not to maximize consumer welfare, low prices, but to disperse private power and foster small businesses, strong communities, worker empowerment, and a robust, stable democracy. My organization, the American Economic Liberties Project, just this January, published a 200-page report called "The Courage to Learn" that explains why this ideological underpinning has been so dangerous and lays out a lengthy and detailed document for how the Biden administration and Congress should begin to change it. So to me, it feels like we are at a make or break moment. We're seeing so much interest and so much momentum from Congress all the way down to state legislatures and local chambers, local governments, and how to fight monopoly power. So we hope that you'll join us and make this a break 'em up moment too. Thanks, Erica.
I just love that Justice Brandeis quote. You can have democracy or wealth concentration. You can't have both. So let's dive into wealth concentration with Chuck Collins, the author of The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions. Chuck?
Thanks, Erica. I'm going to tell you 5 things that you don't know about wealth hoarders and the wealth defense industry. 1. The super wealthy have hidden over $24 trillion globally in offshore tax havens, anonymous shell companies, and trusts. 2. The United States is now the number 2 global tax haven in the world, thanks to our weak laws and states like Delaware. If you are a dictator that stole money from your own people, or you're a Chinese billionaire or a Russian oligarch, and you're looking for a place to park your money outside your country, the U.S. is your destination. 3. The number of family offices that serve the rich has grown from 1,000 to 10,000 in the last 30 years. The mission of a family office is wealth preservation and family dynasty building. Tax avoidance is central to their purpose. 4. The wealth is not stashed on some Caribbean island, sipping a fruity cocktail. More likely, it's parked in that residential luxury tower just down the street. 5. The super wealthy get a lot of help. They hire the wealth defense industry, an armada of tax attorneys, accountants, and wealth managers. They pay millions to hide trillions. But how do they do it? Well, they start in Delaware and South Dakota. These are 2 states that have morphed their laws to attract trillions in hidden wealth. Delaware is famous for its limited liability companies, where no one has to disclose who the real owners are. Sex traffickers, grifters, global dictators, child pornographers, they love Delaware LLCs. Over in South Dakota, the wealth and defense industry got the state to change its laws to enable perpetual dynasty trusts, where people can sequester wealth for centuries. A decade ago, South Dakota trust companies held $57 billion in assets. By the end of 2020, that total had risen over $350 billion. These states are like bad absentee owners in the neighborhood. They house the criminal elements that terrorize the town. But when the neighbors complain, they just shrug their shoulders. Hey, we're making a lot of money here. There are 3 reasons why you should care about hidden wealth. 1. Inequality is higher today than it has been in 100 years, and it's the root cause of our social unrest. We can't take another generation of entrenched inequality. Second reason you should care is if we stay on inequality autopilot, 20 years from now, America will have a hereditary aristocracy of wealth and power, where the sons and daughters of today's billionaires will dominate our politics, economy, philanthropy, and culture. The wealthy and their advisors are bringing a new feudalism to America. They are creating dynasties of wealth and power. The third reason is if we can't find their money, we can't tax it. Like patrons in a restaurant after an extravagant party, the rich are trying to slip out the back door of the restaurant before the bill comes due. And to be clear, when billionaires and millionaires dodge taxes, you pay more, either in higher taxes or cuts in essential services. Here's the good news. We can absolutely fix this. First, we have to get our own USA house in order. One good thing happened in December 2020. Congress passed the corporate transparency law requiring corporations to disclose who their beneficial owners are, who those real owners are. Unfortunately, lawmakers didn't include trusts and partnerships, so the wealth defense industry is going to find new ways to hide money. We need to strengthen that law. Second, we need to beef up the enforcement of existing tax laws. Congress should pass the Stop Tax Cheaters Act to put more resources into oversight. 3, we should just outlaw certain types of trusts and tax loopholes that exist solely for hiding money. Finally, we need to work across borders to lift up global standards. The Patriotic Millionaires have formed an international group to push for reforms and to shut down this global wealth hiding apparatus. Read my new book, The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions, to learn more about what we can do together. I aspire to be the Marie Kondo of wealth unhoarding. She's so inspiring. I would invite wealthy people to come and hold those dynasty trust documents in their hands and just ask themselves, does this spark joy on a cellular level? Does it make you feel the suffering and inequality around the world? Does it make you feel sick? If it does, discard it and let it go. Remember, wealth hoarding is bad for everyone, including the hoarders.
Chuck, thank you so much. You're so right. Hoarding is bad for everybody, including the hoarders. I'm sure some of you all have seen that TV show on A&E. It ran for 11 seasons. One of the women on that show kept all of her dead cats in the refrigerator next to her condiments. So she would reach in to grab the mustard and brush past Fluffy. Bad for Fluffy. Bad for that woman. And as far as wealth hoarding is concerned, it's really bad for the country. The country is more unequal today than it has been in 100 years. And that inequality is the root cause of our social unrest. How does all of that inequality take hold and just keep going and going? For that, let's turn to Vic Fleischer.
Hi, I'm Vic Fleischer. I'm a law professor at UC Irvine. In the past few years, I've been researching the sources of inequality in the United States. And I can tell you one of the biggest sources of structural inequality in the United States is the tax code. Our tax system is supposed to be progressive, where the richest pay more than the middle and working class. Instead, our tax code allows the very richest to pay tax at a lower rate than a teacher or a firefighter or a doctor or a nurse. How does that happen? Well, it starts with the fact that the tax code values money differently depending on how you make it. Let's start with one of the most egregious loopholes, the carried interest loophole. I'm most known in Washington for writing a law review article back in 2007 that started the debate about how to tax carried interest. Here's how it works. Private equity fund managers take 20% of the profits of each fund that they manage, known as the carried interest, as compensation for their services in managing the fund. Top fund managers like Steve Schwartzman at Blackstone and Leon Black at Apollo can make hundreds of millions of dollars a year from carried interest. Because of a quirk of the way that our tax rules work, that compensation is usually taxed at lower capital gains rates instead of much higher ordinary income tax rates. Carried interest is just one example of how the richest and most powerful individuals use well-funded lobbying campaigns to create unfairness in the tax code. A lot of what qualifies as capital gains is really labor income in disguise. Not just carried interest, but things like dividend recaps, where fund managers use debt to extract cash out of portfolio companies, making those companies more vulnerable to bankruptcy. And founder stock, like the billions made by Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos, that will either be taxed at low capital gains rates, or if they give those shares to their heirs, never taxed at all. With the election of President Biden, Vice President Harris, and Democratic control of both the House and the Senate, we have the best chance in years to address these problems of unfairness and inequality in the tax code. Paying your fair share of taxes shouldn't be optional just because you're super rich. Last year, billionaires paid a lower effective tax rate than every other group of Americans. It's time for all of us to pay our fair share.
I think the only thing that annoys me more than the minimum wage is the carried interest loophole. I actually had a billionaire call me one day. He was kind of interested in the work of the Patriotic Millionaires, and we chatted, but I knew his business had been in real estate. So I explained to him that we were very adamantly opposed to the carried interest loophole. Well, he spent the next 20 minutes mansplaining to me why every industry deserves a little loophole. Needless to say, he did not join our group. He was one of these wealthy people who just seems to believe the economy should be specifically designed to deliver the results to people like him. Luckily, not everybody wants to have that kind of economy. Let's turn to Kate Taylor Mighty. Kate?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Taylor Mighty. My pronouns are she, her, and on behalf of the Groundwork Collaborative, I have a very important message. We are the economy, every worker and consumer, Black, white, and brown. We are the economy, not the stock market. And that means that the economy only does well when all of us, including the most marginalized people among us, are thriving. Under that definition, it's clear that our economy was in crisis pre-COVID and is in even more trouble now. Wrong-headed and racist policy choices have landed us here in the midst of a pandemic and deep recession that has wreaked havoc on families and communities across the country and has been most acutely devastating for Black, brown, and Indigenous communities. The only way out of this crisis is smart, massive public investment in the people who make up our economy. Our economy is all of us, not just the wealthy and powerful few. And that means that we can't fix our economy by catering to corporations, the stock market, and the rich. Bold public investment targeted to the people and institutions who need it most will get and keep families in homes, ensure workers can get good jobs, keep communities healthy and safe, and in turn, drive economic growth. For generations, many have observed that when wealth and power become too concentrated in the hands of too few, usually white people, those few always rig the rules to benefit themselves at everyone else's expense. We've seen the results as we've faced record income and wealth inequality alongside stagnating economic and real wage growth and a political sphere increasingly overwhelmed by powerful special interests. The good news is we all have the solution: public power. Public power is the power we wield when we come together to do more than we can do on our own as private individuals, when we come together in labor unions and worker centers, direct action formations, and accountable governments. Public power is also the only real counterweight to harmful concentrations of private power. It's the engine behind every hard-won labor, environmental, and consumer protection we now take for granted, and it's the key to securing the massive, equitable public investment we need to get our economy working for all of us. We have the key to fixing our economy, coming together to turn our collective power into public investment in everyday people. So let's make sure we fight for what we know we need to get our economy on track. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. This really isn't rocket science. If we want things to get better, we have to spend money. We have to invest in our people and in our country to recover from the global pandemic of COVID and from the economic collapse that followed. But we've already seen it. The deficit police go nuts when you try to spend money actually helping people instead of doing things like giving tax cuts to rich people. So the deficit police are on the case. The sky is falling. The sky is falling. We're going to run out of money. Are they right? For the answer, we're going to turn to Stephanie Kelton. She is the author of The Deficit Myth. Stephanie, are we going to run out of money?
Well, no, Erica, we're not going to run out of money. At least the federal government isn't going to run out of money. The federal government's nothing like a household. It's nothing like a private business. Households and businesses can run out of money. They can go broke. But Congress is different. Congress has something the rest of us don't have. It has the power of the purse, which really means that Congress can commit to spending money that it doesn't have. How does it do that? It did it in March of last year when it passed a $2.2 trillion package called the CARES Act. And it did it just again this March when it passed a recovery package, the COVID recovery package, a $1.9 trillion package that will send money to struggling households and to small businesses that are trying to keep workers on payroll, help with unemployment, vaccine rollout, and all the rest. So Congress has committed trillions of dollars, and the money comes from the votes. If Congress writes a bill and they can collect enough votes to pass the legislation, well, the money is there. And when Congress passes these multi-trillion-dollar bills, what's really happening is that Congress is saying to its bank, the Federal Reserve, get ready. We have just ordered up $1.9 trillion. Go out and make those payments on behalf of the US Treasury. And that's the Fed's job. In part, the Federal Reserve is there to carry out payments that are authorized by Congress on behalf of the US Treasury. Now, those payments might get too big. It is possible for Congress to overspend. There is a limit. So the punishment for overspending would be inflation. It wouldn't be running out of money like a household or going bankrupt like a private business. When you spend too much money for Congress, the real risk is inflation. So let's talk about inflation. Are we at risk today of overheating the economy because the government has committed too many dollars? There are some economists who believe so, but the vast majority don't. Our economy is still very depressed. We have almost 10 million people who are still jobless as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, and we're digging out of a very deep hole. We're going to be in a situation for a prolonged period of time where we are still trying to recover this economy. And, on the other side of this COVID relief package, there is a recovery package that we have yet to see. And that means that Congress wants to spend more. They want to spend more addressing some of the long-term problems in our economy, deficiency, shortfalls, real deficits in our infrastructure, in our healthcare system, in our education system, and so on. To get at those problems, Congress is going to need to spend more. And the question is, can they afford to do it? The answer is, of course they can. The relevant concern as we go forward is making sure that Congress puts together a spending bill that avoids creating inflation problems while spending money where we need it in the economy to address the real deficits that we have in healthcare, education, the climate, infrastructure, and so on.
In addition to spending money to get ourselves out of the hole we're in, we also really just need to reshape our economy. For thoughts on that, let's turn to Felicia Wong.
I'm Felicia Wong, President and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute. And I'm here with a pretty simple message, which is to say that right now, a new economy is possible. And that means that a new world is possible. Part of the reason that we know a new economy is possible is that the COVID pandemic and the COVID recession have really revealed all the things that were wrong with the old economy. Some people say that the economy now is K-shaped. We have some people doing extraordinarily well. And we have many, many, many millions of people suffering without jobs, lower incomes, and really they're suffering out of sight. And we know that this isn't the way that we want to live. And we also know that this isn't the way that we need to live. My colleagues and I at the Roosevelt Institute have been doing work for the past 10 years to demonstrate a few pretty basic things. The first is that we should be investing federal money into creating jobs that would build the kind of economy and world that we want to live in. We can have an economy that is more caring. We can care for those who are most vulnerable around us, and we can get paid well to do it. Care for kids, care for the elderly. We can also build an economy that essentially cares for the planet. We can have millions of new good jobs that would decarbonize our polluted environment and make sure that we actually have a healthy environment to leave to our kids. Just imagine an economy that works in this way and where people are paid well to do these kinds of jobs. We actually know that, again, that this is something that we can create. And I'm also really encouraged by the fact that these aren't just ideas, being dreamed about by some thinkers, but actually many of the people who have been most fundamental in bringing about this new economic thinking are now in power. Many of these people now work for the Biden administration, and it's one of the reasons that you see proposals now for multiple trillions of dollars, not just to rescue the American economy from the ravages of COVID, but actually to build a stronger, more vibrant world for our kids to live in. So I'm beyond thrilled that we're living at a time when new ideas are real, new ideas are walking around the White House, in the form of people, of course. But I'm also, there's a real worry, of course. And the worry is that the system that we find ourselves in, this system where a few Senate rules and the ways in which we elect our officials, this system is actually stuck in reverse. And it's almost designed to prevent the kind of change I'm talking about. And it's designed to prevent the kinds of forward-looking investments, even when those investments are extraordinarily popular. 70% of all Americans basically believe in all of the ideas that I have been laying out. And yet we have a political system that isn't majoritarian, that isn't democratic, small d. It's actually minoritarian. It's not fully allowing for the kinds of change that we know could be real. So again, I'm beyond thrilled to be living at a time when change is possible. And I am deeply worried that we won't be able to get there because our political system is so broken. We need to fix both. We need to imagine both a new economy and a new politics. And I hope that everyone listening will put shoulder to the wheel and join me in trying to make this new world possible. Thank you.
Felicia hit on something that I think is really important, and that's that a lot of the reforms that need to happen are actually wildly popular with the bipartisan majority of Americans, but they seem to be dead on arrival when they get to the Senate. How does that happen? For that, we're going to turn to Adam Gentleson. He is the author of Kill Switch: The Rise of the Modern Senate and the Crippling of Democracy.
We've heard a lot this afternoon about how the will of the majority is being thwarted at the voting booth, but the will of the majority is also being thwarted in the United States Senate. For the arc of history to bend towards justice, it has to go through the United States Senate, and that is where it runs up against the Senate filibuster. The filibuster has been the subject of a 2 centuries long power shift from a careful balance between majority rule and minority rights that the framers intended to create towards a dramatic tilt in favor of the minority, into a system where the minority now has a veto over the will of the majority. That is not what the framers wanted. The framers created the Senate to be a thoughtful counterweight to the House of Representatives. They wanted it to be deliberative and they wanted it to be thoughtful, but they also wanted it to be majority rule. They were very clear about this, and they also set clear rules that Senate debate should be limited, thoughtful, and relevant to the topic at hand, not obstructive. In the middle of the 19th century, the slave power started to see that the march of progress and the march of the majority were going to carry the country towards abolition. So they started to increase the power of the minority. John C. Calhoun, senator from South Carolina, scion of the slave power and grandfather of the Confederacy, innovated what we would think of today as the talking filibuster. His goal was to give this minority more power to obstruct the progress of the majority. He was very clear that he thought the system that James Madison had designed did not give sufficient power to the minority, and he wanted the minority not to have a role in the process or a voice in the process or input. He wanted the minority, Calhoun wanted the minority, to have a veto. In the 20th century, senators started to figure out how to apply the supermajority threshold that we are familiar with today to legislation by using the filibuster. This was an explicitly white supremacist, racist minority of senators. Don't take my word for it. That's what they called themselves. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, who led this Southern bloc, said that any Southern man worth a pinch of salt would give his all to maintain white supremacy. They started to apply the supermajority threshold only to civil rights. From up through the 1960s, the only issue in American life that was forced to clear a supermajority threshold in the Senate was civil rights. Fast forward to today, and we are now applying this threshold that caused civil rights to fail to pass for nearly 100 years to every other issue. And what are we seeing? We're seeing issues with broad bipartisan support fail. This was what happened to civil rights. We tend to think that we weren't ready, perhaps, as a country to pass civil rights until the 1950s or 60s, but that's simply not true. When Southerners started to apply the supermajority threshold to civil rights bills were passing the House by wide margins, coming over to the Senate, where they had majority support, and they had presidents of both parties ready to sign them. They also had broad support among the American people. When Gallup first polled the issue of anti-lynching laws in 1937, it found 72% of the American people in support. When it polled anti-poll tax laws in the 1940s, it found upwards of 60% of Americans in support. Now project that onto today. We are seeing the supermajority threshold that prevented progress on civil rights, even though Americans were ready for it. We are seeing the supermajority threshold delay progress on all other issues. In particular, we are seeing it delay progress on voting rights. The filibuster is the single reason why we cannot pass a common sense, pragmatic voting rights bill today. It is the single reason why we see gridlock on issues from climate change to income inequality to expansions of rights across the board. This power shift from the careful balance between majority rule and minority rights that the framers tried to strike to a system where the minority wields a veto is due to the filibuster, and it is the primary reason our federal government is gridlocked today.
Adam, thank you so much. Raise your hand if you find the U.S. Senate one of the most irritating institutions in the country. Yep, the U.S. Senate, where great ideas go to die. But here's the thing. They like to say it's because of the parliamentarian or rules or norms or this and that. But what if it really isn't because of any of that? What if it's just because of money? Jimmy Carter said that the United States had become an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery. And certainly the U.S. Senate as an institution has been hamstrung in delivering what the people want. So what's going on? Let's turn to Tiffany Muller. Tiffany?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany Muller, the president of In Citizens United and Let America Vote. 5 years ago this month, I came to In Citizens United because this organization is dedicated to putting the power of our democracy back into the hands of the people. And right now, we know Washington isn't working for most Americans. In fact, it's rigged against most of us. One of the guiding principles of my career has been to give a voice to those who don't have one, starting with advocating for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, to fighting for LGBT rights against hostile opponents in my hometown of Topeka, Kansas, to now helping lead the fight against big money and corporate influence. It's not only about protecting people's voice and vote in elections, but leveling the field so that government is responsive to the people. I want my daughter and all of our kids to live in a world where their rights are protected, where they have a healthy environment and a fair shot to compete in the economy. We all know that future is at risk, because right now, it's those who write the biggest checks who have the biggest say. And this broken system is why Congress was quick to pass COVID relief for corporations, but passing any support for families has been a major fight. And frankly, the relief has been inadequate. It's why drug companies can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying and funding super PACs and dark money groups, and walk away with a $76 billion tax cut, but your drug prices haven't gone down. And it's why Congress passes corporate tax cuts, but not an increase in the minimum wage. It's perpetuating a system of economic inequality that has become as bad as it's been in generations. But In Citizens United is fighting back. We're still a young organization, but we certainly have made some old enemies. K Street, the corporate PACs, and their lobbyists are no fans of ours. And we take pride in that, because we know that to change the system, we need to shake up the status quo. In 2018, we began to work closely with candidates, encouraging them to run on anti-corruption reforms, limiting the power of big money, refusing donations from corporate PACs. And guess what? We took back the House. And in 2020, we did the same with Senate candidates, and we won back the Senate. The result is that both the House and Senate have made the For the People Act a top priority in their chambers, naming it HR1 and S1 respectively, as a mark of its significance. Only 4 times in the last 20 years have HR1 and S1 been the same bill, and every time it's become law. We expect this time will be no different. We are on the verge of victory. The House passed HR1 earlier this month, and the Senate is holding a hearing on S1 today. This won't be easy, but this bill is too popular and too important to let a minority use old processes and procedures to hold it up. We welcome the support of Republicans in Congress, but we are not going to let them obstruct real progress for the American people. Whether it's with 60 votes or an update to Senate procedures, we're working with the leaders of the bill to ensure it will pass. The For the People Act will unrig so much of the broken system. It will allow us to get Washington working for everyone, regardless of their political party. And it can make a real difference in the lives of Americans and help us address the economic inequality plaguing this country. And that is worth the fight. Thank you so much.
We are clearly awash with corporate money and with special interest money, and it has distorted our democracy and put our whole American experience under threat. To get a little historical perspective on this and to see both how much we have improved and ways that we can continue to improve as we move towards our 250th birthday, here is my great friend, Michael Waldman.
I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. And the great fight that we're having over our democracy can feel new, but it goes back to the very beginning of our country. At first, only white men who owned property could vote. But the ideals of the revolution began to challenge that and change that. In 1776, Ben Franklin led the writing of a new constitution for Pennsylvania. And they eliminated that property requirement. And here's what Ben Franklin said. He said, there's a man who owns a jackass. It's worth $50, so the man can vote. Then the jackass dies. The man is older, he's wiser, but the jackass is dead, so the man can't vote. So who really has the right to vote? Asked Ben Franklin. The man or the jackass? Good question. Up in Massachusetts, they took a different view. John Adams was writing their constitution, and he was urged to do the same thing, to end the property requirement for voting. And he was aghast. He said, if we do that, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of 18 will demand the right to vote. Men who have not a farthing to their name will demand the right to vote. There will be no end of it. And that's really the story of our whole country's history. People demanding a seat at the table, people demanding that we expand the circle of democracy, and other people fighting to keep their power and fighting just as hard to stop it. And that's the moment we're living in again today in a very significant way. Think about what happened in 2020. It was something of a civic miracle. Despite the pandemic and despite voter suppression and lies, it was the highest voter turnout since 1900. What's been the response? Well, Donald Trump's big lie about the election leading to an insurrection at the Capitol, and now a wave of laws in state legislatures being proposed all over the country to restrict the vote, the most significant since the Jim Crow era. And these proposals, not surprisingly, are targeted at black voters, at brown voters, at young people, at poor people. The Brennan Center has analyzed this. It's 4 times as many proposals as just 2 years ago. It's extraordinary. It's one of the biggest stories in the country. But there's something else happening too. Congress has the power, legally and constitutionally, to stop it cold. The question is, does it have the political will to do it? The For the People Act, HR1, S1, as it's called in the Senate, would stop this voter suppression wave. It would make access to early voting and automatic early voting and vote by mail universal for everybody, no matter what state they live in. It would make automatic voter registration the law of the land. It would ban partisan gerrymandering, and it would institute small donor public financing, campaign finance reform, so that ordinary citizens would have the loudest voice, even in an era of super PACs and dark money. It would be the most important civil rights bill of our time. It would be the most sweeping democracy reform in over half a century, and Congress can do it. The question is, will Congress do it? That's up to them, and it's really up to all of us. We all have a chance to insist that this moment in history is one not where we go backwards in our democracy, but where we keep going forwards. In a few years, our country is going to be 250 years old. This is going to be one of those times people look back and say, either they let their democracy slip away or they picked it up and carried it forward. Let's make sure that's what we do.
Michael, thank you so much. I love knowing that there's something we can all do right now to preserve and protect our democracy. And now to round out this wonderful day that we've spent with these great speakers, I'm so delighted to introduce Professor Tim Snyder. He's joining us from Vienna. Tim is a historian of fascism and the author of multiple books, including the New York Times #1 bestseller, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century.
Coming in at the end of this conversation, I want to speak to you about the future. The future is essential for democracy. Democracy depends upon an idea of the future, a vision of a plausible future. Democracy is about thinking historically. It's about considering the past, making the decision in the present, your vote, with an expectation that there's going to be a future that you might change. One of the deep, deep problems in the United States today is the disappearance of the future. If you think about January 6th and you're against it, you're against the riot in the Capitol, the invasion of the Capitol, that wasn't a moment in which it seemed like the American future looked very bright. But even if you were in favor of those events, even if you're one of those people storming the Capitol, what does it mean to be waving a Confederate flag inside the Capitol? That's not a vision of the future. That's some kind of nostalgia about the past. It has nothing to do with the democracy. So the thesis that I want to advance here in 3 brief parts is that inequality of wealth, inequality of power have traduced and undermined an American sense of the future. The first way is the most familiar. And this is a point that Mr. Trump made correctly when he says the American dream is dead. For the past 40 years, as a result of increasing inequality of wealth and increasing inequality of income, American social mobility has radically slowed. This means that young Americans quite rightly think that they're less likely to live as well as their parents. They're less likely to have independent lives. They may not even live as long as their parents or their grandparents. So in that basic broad gauge way, inequality of wealth and income collapses the future. Number 2 is what I would call digital oligarchy. The emergence of social media in the last 10 years has very dramatically affected the way that we think about time. We are constantly enraptured by, or at least caught up in, a kind of eternal present. We look at the screens, we spend our time being stimulated, we get used to regular sorts of gratification, and we find ourselves cut off from the past, cut off from the future, unable to think in long linear terms about how things were and how things ought to be. This is a profit model. It's made certain people extremely wealthy, but it's inconsistent with democracy. If we allow ourselves to just rest forever in this kind of pool of digital eternity, we lose our prospects for democracy. Number 3 is climate. And here the culprit is what I would call a hydrocarbon oligarchy. We have known for decades, for half a century at this point, about global warming. Global warming is not in doubt. The people who know that global warming is true, the people whose own internal studies were among the first studies to prove the truth of global warming, are the same people who have been denying it for us for the last couple of decades. What this does is that it brings a disaster, a real disaster, closer. If you know that something dreadful has happened, you know that something dreadful is coming, and you're unable to do anything about it because of lying in the system, then you're afraid. In this sense, hydrocarbon oligarchy takes the future away. So we now have three basic ways in which the future is being taken from us. Number one, there's a real problem, global warming, which is being confused for us, making us more fearful. Number two, there is a daily life which is dominated by digital interaction, which keeps our minds away from the long term, either past or future. And number three, as a society, we've lost social mobility, which makes it very hard for young people, for families, to imagine a better future for themselves. Once we see this, we can see the perversions and we can see the hopes. The perversions are escapes. The ideas that very rich people might live forever, or the ideas that we might all escape to Mars, these are perversions. Those are not real futures. The real future has to be built back in very simple ways. We have to get our minds and our policy tools around global warming so we don't fear catastrophe. We have to break up, regulate, and tax social media such that we all have a better chance to access real information about what's happening in our actual lives so we can think sensibly about our past and our future. And we have to give life to unions. We have to give life to healthcare. We have to give life to the welfare state in general so that there's more equality of wealth and income in this country, and so that young people and families can see their way to a better future. Those things are all good in themselves, of course, but they're crucial for democracy, because democracy depends precisely on a sense that there's a future and on a sense that our actions can make that future better than the present. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim. What a wonderful way to conclude our program. Let's find that hope for tomorrow, and let's do the things every day that we need to do to restore our democracy, cure our economy of what ails it, and fix our society. Thank you so much for being part of our program today. I'll turn it to Morris to close us up.
Hey, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about power and money in America. I, of course, want to thank all of our speakers. You guys have done a great job in making me so angry I can hardly think straight. But we're going to get back to work. I'd also like to thank our event consultants, Kimball Stroud and Liz Sizer. I'd like to thank the wonderful folks at ACT TV, Now This, and Bond Events. And of course, our members who make all of this work possible, the Patriotic Millionaires, and the staff who actually does all of the work for which I sometimes take credit. Will, Kat, Deveria, Chloe, Zoe, Clark, Dylan, Fred, Jean, Izzy, Jody, Kelsey Marie, Peter, Chris, Rachel, Bex, Renee, and Sam. You guys do more than I would be willing to ask you to do. If you enjoyed what you learned here and want to join us in the fight to challenge the concentration of wealth and power in America and make the case to our lawmakers that we must change course, please go to taxtherich.com. Thank you.